The crisp morning air carried the scent of sawdust and despair, a fragrance Luca Carter knew better than his own name. Each day, his hands, once skilled enough to coax music from blocks of maple and spruce, were reduced to assembling flat-pack furniture for people who would never know his true craft. He was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the melody of a dream he could no longer afford to remember. He told himself he did it all for his daughter, Lydia, the one bright note in his silent symphony of survival. But one fateful afternoon, on a sun-dappled trail in Whispering Woods Park, a sudden, sharp crack and a child's cry would change everything. Luca was about to discover that sometimes the most profound acts of kindness are simply muscle memory for a heart that has forgotten its own strength. The 5:00 a.m. alarm was a cruel punch to the gut. For Luca Carter, it wasn't the start of a new day, but the continuation of an endless one. He swung his legs over the side of the lumpy mattress, his back groaning in protest. The small apartment in the Oak Haven borough of Westlake was filled with the quiet hum of a city that never slept, a hum that did little to drown out the silence left by his wife, Sarah, 3 years ago. His hands, calloused and scarred, were the last remnants of the man he used to be. They were luthier's hands designed for carving the delicate curve of a guitar's neck, for sensing the resonant potential in a plank of Sitka spruce. Now they wrestled with Allen keys and particle board, building soulless wardrobes and flimsy bookcases for a company called Swift Build. The pay was just enough to keep the lights on and put food on the table for his 8-year-old daughter, Lydia. Just enough. Never more. In the corner of his bedroom, shrouded by a dusty sheet, was a ghost. It was the shape of his last creation, an acoustic guitar, its mahogany body half-finished, its fretboard inlaid with a delicate mother-of-pearl vine that stopped abruptly, just like his life had. He hadn't touched it since the accident that took Sarah. The grief had been a thief, stealing not just his wife, but his passion, his art, and the small workshop he'd poured his soul into. Carter Guitars. The bank had taken the shop, and despair had taken the rest. "Daddy?" A small voice called from the doorway. Luca's face softened instantly. Lydia stood there, her blonde hair a tangled mess, clutching a worn teddy bear. "Morning, Firefly," he murmured, his voice thick with sleep. "Is it Saturday yet?" she asked, her blue eyes wide with hope. He scooped her into his arms, the familiar weight of her a comforting anchor. "It is, and you know what that means." "The woods," she squealed, burying her face in his neck. The weekly hike in Whispering Woods Park was their one non-negotiable luxury. It cost nothing but time, and it was the only place where the city's oppressive noise faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the chatter of birds. It was the only place Luca felt he could breathe. After a simple breakfast of oatmeal and toast, they prepared for their small adventure. Luca filled a worn backpack with a water bottle, a small first aid kit he always carried, a couple of apples, and Lydia's favorite cookies. As he packed, his eyes fell on a small, intricately carved wooden bird sitting on the kitchen windowsill. He'd whittled it for Lydia last winter from a scrap of wood. His fingers still remembered the motions, the way the blade peeled away the unnecessary layers to reveal the form within. It was a faint echo of his old life, a lullaby he could barely recall. "Can we go to the old oak tree, Daddy?" Lydia asked, pulling on her scuffed hiking boots. "The one with the swingy vine?" "You bet," he said, forcing a smile. The truth was, every dollar spent on gas to get to the park was a dollar he had to account for. Last month, the car's alternator had failed, and the repair bill had wiped out what little savings he had. This week, he'd been watering down the milk to make it last. Lydia hadn't noticed. He prayed she never would. He was failing, drowning in slow motion, and the hike was the one gasp of air he got each week before the tide pulled him under again. He zipped up the backpack, the sound sealing his quiet desperation inside, and followed his daughter out the door, into the deceptive promise of a beautiful day. Whispering Woods Park was a sanctuary carved out of the urban sprawl. Tall pines and ancient oaks formed a canopy that dappled the forest floor in shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow. The air was clean, thick with the earthy smell of damp soil and pine needles. For Lydia, it was a magical kingdom. For Luca, It was a temporary reprieve from the suffocating walls of his life. They followed the winding dirt path, Lydia skipping ahead, pointing out squirrels and brightly colored mushrooms. Luca walked behind, a silent guardian, his mind a whirlwind of unpaid bills and anxieties. He forced himself to focus on the present, on the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through the trees. "Look, Daddy! A new friend!" Lydia shouted, pointing towards a clearing near a rocky outcrop. A girl, perhaps a year or two older than Lydia, with a cascade of dark curly hair, was attempting to climb the large rocks. She was dressed in expensive-looking athletic gear that was already smudged with dirt. "Be careful up there," Luca called out instinctively. The girl turned and grinned, her face bright and fearless. "It's okay. I'm an explorer." Lydia giggled and ran towards her. "I'm Lydia. What's your name?" "I'm Zoe," the girl replied, gracefully navigating a tricky foothold. "Want to explore with me? I think there's a secret cave on the other side." Luca watched as the two girls instantly bonded, their shared sense of adventure, bridging the gap of their different worlds. He found a spot on a fallen log, content to watch them, a rare feeling of peace settling over him. He could hear their chatter, a mix of grand imaginary plots and simple observations. He saw Zoe point towards a thick, gnarled vine hanging from a massive oak tree branch overhanging the rocks, the very vine Lydia had been so excited about. "That's the swingy vine," Lydia exclaimed. "My dad says a giant put it there." Zoe's eyes lit up. "Let's try it." A knot of unease tightened in Luca's stomach. "Girls, maybe not right now. It looks a little wet from the rain yesterday," he called out. "We'll be careful," Zoe shouted back, already scrambling towards the vine. It happened in a horrifying split second. Zoe grabbed the vine, kicked off from the rock, and swung out over the clearing. For a moment, she was suspended in the air, a picture of pure joy. Then her hands, slick with morning dew, slipped. She didn't scream on the way down. The only sounds were a gasp of air and then a sickening, unnatural crack that cut through the forest's peaceful hum. It was a sound Luca knew from his workshop, the sound of wood splitting under too much pressure. But this wasn't wood. Zoe lay crumpled on the ground at the base of the rocks, her face a mask of shock and white-hot pain. Lydia froze, her hands flying to her mouth, a silent scream in her eyes. Luca was moving before he even processed the thought. He sprinted the 30 yards to Zoe's side, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Zoe? Honey, can you hear me? Don't move!" Tears were streaming down her face, but she was trying to be brave. "My leg," she whimpered, her voice trembling. It hurts so much." His eyes went to her left leg. It was bent at an angle that was fundamentally wrong. A clean break, tibia and fibula most likely. His mind, usually clouded with worry, became razor sharp. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Okay, Zoe, you're going to be all right," he said, his voice a low, calming rumble. "My name is Luca. I'm going to help you." He looked at Lydia, who was pale and shaking. "Firefly, I need you to be my brave little helper. Can you get the backpack for me?" Lydia nodded, snapping out of her shock, and ran to retrieve the bag. Luca gently took Zoe's hand. "We need to get you to a doctor. I'm going to have to move you, and it's going to hurt. But I'll be as careful as I can. Can you be strong for me?" Zoe nodded, biting her lips so hard it turned white. Using 2 sturdy branches from a fallen tree and the straps from his backpack, Luca improvised a crude but effective splint, immobilizing the leg as best he could. Every touch, no matter how gentle, elicited a pained gasp from the little girl. He worked with a focused efficiency, his hands moving with a surgeon's precision. Once the leg was secured, the next problem became terrifyingly clear. They were deep in the park, at least a 2-mile hike from the parking lot. He checked his phone. No signal. Of course. "All right, explorer," he said softly to Zoe, managing a weak smile. "Looks like this is the hardest part of the expedition. I'm going to carry you." He carefully scooped her up into his arms, her head resting on his shoulder. She weighed more than Lydia, and the awkward angle required to protect her injured leg put an immediate strain on his back. He looked at his own daughter, whose face was a mixture of fear and awe. "Lydia, I need you to lead the way. Just follow the path back to the car. You're the leader now." Lydia's chin jutted out with determination. She nodded, wiped her eyes, and started walking. And so began the longest 2 miles of Luca Carter's life, carrying a stranger's child through the silent woods, each step a testament to a strength he thought he had long since lost. The journey back was an agonizing marathon. Every step sent a jolt of pain through Luca's screaming muscles. Zoe was fading in and out of consciousness, her small body limp in his arms, occasionally whimpering as a particularly rough patch of terrain jostled her injured leg. Lydia walked ahead, a small, determined scout, her bright pink jacket a beacon in the green and brown tapestry of the forest. She kept looking back, her eyes wide with concern, not just for Zoe, but for her father, whose strained breathing was now loud in the quiet woods. By the time the trailhead and the parking lot came into view, Luca was drenched in sweat, his vision blurring at the edges. His legs felt like jelly, and a searing pain shot up his spine with every movement. He stumbled the last few yards to his dented 10-year-old sedan and gently laid Zoe down on the grass, propping her head up with his own jacket. "You did it, Daddy," Lydia whispered, her voice filled with reverence. He just nodded, too exhausted to speak, his hands on his knees as he gasped for air. He finally fumbled for his phone. One bar of signal. He was about to dial 911 when a sleek, black Audi A8 pulled into the parking lot with a quiet crunch of gravel, parking several spots away. A woman emerged from the driver's side. She was tall and impeccably dressed in tailored gray trousers and a silk blouse, her dark hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. Her face was etched with a frantic worry that was at odds with her controlled appearance. Her eyes scanned the lot, and when they landed on the small group by Luca's car, they widened in a mixture of terror and relief. "Zoe!" she cried, her voice sharp and clear as she ran towards them. She dropped to her knees beside her daughter, her hands hovering, afraid to touch. "Oh, my baby! What happened? Are you okay?" "Mommy?" Zoe whimpered, her eyes fluttering open. "I fell. My leg hurts." The woman, Catherine Beaumont, though Luca didn't know it yet, gently stroked her daughter's hair, her composure cracking. She looked at Luca, her gaze sweeping over his sweat-soaked t-shirt, his worn jeans, and his old car. Her expression shifted from frantic relief to a cold, analytical suspicion. "Who are you? What happened here?" she demanded, her tone clipped and accusatory. Luca, still catching his breath, straightened up. "My name is Luca Carter. Our daughters were playing. She fell from the rocks over by the old oak. Her leg is broken. I carried her back here." Catherine's eyes narrowed. "You carried her? Why didn't you call an ambulance?" "There's no signal deeper in the park," he explained, his voice flat with exhaustion. "This was the fastest way to get her help." Catherine pulled out her own phone, a state-of-the-art device, and dialed a number with practiced speed. "Robert, I have her. She's injured, broken leg. Meet me at Oakhaven General main entrance, and get Dr. Peterson on the line, now." She snapped the phone shut and turned her attention back to Zoe, completely dismissing Luca. Another car, a black SUV, pulled up silently. A man in a dark suit, Mr. Davies, Catherine's head of security, got out. He assessed the scene with a practiced, dispassionate gaze. Catherine stood up, her composure fully restored. She was now a CEO managing a crisis. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick leather wallet. She extracted a wad of cash, hundreds at least, and held it out to Luca. "Thank you for your assistance," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. It was a transaction, a payment for services rendered. Luca stared at the money in her hand, then at her cold, impassive face. A slow burn of anger started deep in his chest. All the pain, the fear, the grueling effort of the past hour reduced to this. A tip. He slowly shook his head. "No." Catherine's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose slightly. "Excuse me?" "I don't want your money," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I helped your daughter because she was hurt. That's it." Mr. Davies took a step closer, his hands subtly moving inside his jacket. Catherine held up a hand to stop him, her gaze fixed on Luca, reevaluating him. She saw the defiant pride in his tired eyes, the integrity that refused to be bought. To her, it didn't compute. In her world, everything and everyone had a price. A man who looked like he desperately needed money refusing it was not an act of nobility. It was an anomaly. and anomalies were threats. "As you wish," she said coolly. She and Davies carefully lifted Zoe and placed her in the back of the spacious Audi. Lydia watched, clutching Luca's hand, confused by the cold tension in the air. As the Audi sped away, leaving Luca and Lydia in a cloud of dust, Catherine glanced in her rearview mirror. She saw the man and his small daughter standing by their beat-up car, looking impossibly small and insignificant. But for the first time that day, a sliver of something other than fear or anger entered her mind. A disquieting, unwelcome flicker of curiosity. Why would a man who had nothing refuse the one thing she could offer? The sterile white halls of Oak Haven General Hospital were a blur to Catherine Beaumont. Her world had narrowed to the beeping machines, the hushed tones of doctors, and the pale, pained face of her daughter. Dr. Peterson, the best orthopedist in the state, had confirmed it. A compound fracture of both the tibia and fibula. Zoe was brave through it all, even managing a weak smile for her mother before the anesthesia took her into surgery. Now, sitting in the private waiting room she had demanded, Catherine's mind was finally free to churn. The fear for Zoe was slowly being replaced by a cold, simmering anger. Anger at her own helplessness, at the nanny who was supposed to be watching Zoe, and at the gaping hole in her security that allowed her daughter to be alone and get hurt. And a significant portion of that anger was directed at the unknown man in the park. Her phone buzzed. It was Robert Davies, her head of security, a man whose loyalty was matched only by his profound cynicism. "She's out of surgery," Catherine said, her voice clipped. "She's stable. I want to know everything about him." "Already on it, Ms. Beaumont." Davies' voice was a gravelly purr on the other end of the line. "Luca Carter, age 38, resident of the Westlake Borough. Widower." "Go on." "It's not a pretty picture," Davies continued, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. "He used to own a small business, a custom guitar shop called Carter Guitars. Went bankrupt 3 years ago, right after his wife died. Piled up a significant amount of debt. Lost the shop, their house. Now he lives in a low-income apartment and works for a gig economy company assembling furniture. Financially, he's on the brink." Catherine closed her eyes, a wave of vindication washing over her. Of course, it all made sense now. The refusal of the money wasn't pride. It was a tactic. He was playing a longer game. A lawsuit, perhaps? A sob story for the tabloids about the heroic poor man and the cold-hearted billionaire? "He has a daughter," Davies added. "Lydia Carter, age 8. Her presence lends a certain sympathetic quality to the situation." "He put himself in a position to be a hero," Catherine mused, her voice turning to ice. "He found my daughter alone. An accident happens. He carries her out, refuses a small payment, knowing the potential for a much larger one down the line. It's smart, I'll give him that." "It's a classic opportunist's playbook, Ms. Beaumont," Davies agreed readily. He was feeding her own fears back to her, expertly framing the narrative. A man this desperate, people do things they wouldn't normally do. His proximity to Zoe was convenient. The implication hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Davies wasn't just suggesting Luca was an opportunist. He was hinting that the accident might not have been entirely accidental. It was a vile thought, but in Catherine's world, where she was surrounded by people who wanted something from her, it was also a plausible one. She had built Beaumont Holdings by anticipating threats, by seeing the hidden angles, by never, ever taking anyone at face value. "Keep digging," she commanded. "I want to know who he talks to, where he goes. I want to know about his late wife, the details of his business failure. I want to know everything, and have legal draw up a non-disclosure agreement with a settlement, a generous one, something that will make this whole thing disappear." "Consider it done," Davies said. Hanging up, Catherine stared out the window at the city lights. She saw a world of predators and prey, of calculated moves and strategic alliances. Kindness was a currency for the naive. Luca Carter, the struggling single father with the kind eyes, was just another player in the game, and Catherine Beaumont never ever lost. Meanwhile, miles away in his cramped apartment, Luca was gently tucking Lydia into bed. He had spent the evening reassuring her that Zoe would be okay, that doctors would fix her leg. But now, alone in the quiet, the day's events crashed down on him. His back was a solid wall of fire. He was beyond exhausted. But it wasn't the physical pain that kept him awake. It was the memory of Catherine Beaumont's face, her suspicion, her dismissal, the way she had looked at him as if he were something she had scraped off her shoe. He thought of the money she'd offered. For a fleeting second, he'd been tempted. That cash could have meant a new alternator and a full pantry for months. It could have meant new shoes for Lydia, a proper winter coat. It could have meant a tiny bit of breathing room in his suffocating life. But his refusal hadn't been a tactic. It had been instinct. Sarah had always said his pride was his best and worst quality. Looking at the shrouded guitar in the corner, he felt a familiar ache. That was his pride, his soul, collecting dust. He had helped that little girl because it was the right thing to do. It was who he was, or at least who he used to be. And no amount of money could buy back the pieces of himself he felt he had lost. He just hoped his one decent act in years wouldn't come back to haunt him. The days that followed were a return to the monotonous grind, yet everything felt different. The encounter in the park had left an indelible mark. For Luca, it was a lingering ache in his back and the disquieting memory of Catherine Beaumont's cold eyes. For Lydia, it was a constant stream of questions. "Do you think Zoe is okay, Daddy?" she'd ask over breakfast. "Is her leg healing?" "I'm sure it is, Firefly. She has the best doctors. Can we send her a get-well card?" They spent an afternoon creating a card, Lydia meticulously drawing a picture of the two of them as explorers on one side, and a picture of a smiling Zoe with a brightly colored cast on the other. Luca wrote a simple message inside, "Hoping you have a speedy recovery, from Luca and Lydia." He addressed it to Zoe at Oakhaven General Hospital, hoping it would somehow find its way to her. The act felt right, a simple human gesture, but it did little to ease the feeling of unease that had settled over him. He started noticing things. A black sedan, similar to the one he'd seen in the park, seemed to be parked down the street from his apartment building more often than was plausible. He dismissed it as paranoia, a side effect of stress and exhaustion. A week after the accident, the other shoe dropped. A courier arrived at his door with a thick, ominous-looking envelope from the law firm of Prescott, Finch and Gable. His hands trembled slightly as he signed for it. Inside, he found two things. The first was a check. The number written on it made his breath catch in his throat. $50,000. It was more money than he had seen in one place in his entire life. It was a lifeline. It was a solution to 100 different problems. It was an escape. The second document stole all the air from his lungs. It was a multi-page legal agreement. He scanned the dense jargon: non-disclosure, confidentiality, release of all claims, no further contact. It was a contract to buy his silence. It stipulated that by accepting the money, he agreed to never speak of the incident, never identify the Beaumont family, and, most woundingly, never attempt to contact Zoe or her mother again. The initial shock gave way to a cold, hard rage. This wasn't a gesture of gratitude. It was an insult, a threat wrapped in a bribe. Catherine Beaumont wasn't thanking him. She was trying to scrub him from her life, to erase the inconvenient memory of a dirty, working-class man who had dared to touch her pristine world. She believed he was an opportunist, a problem to be managed, and this was her solution. Lydia walked into the living room, holding the get-well card. "Can we mail this now, Daddy?" Luca looked from the check in his hand to the hopeful innocence on his daughter's face. He saw the two worlds colliding, the cynical, transactional world of Catherine Beaumont and the simple, kind world he was trying to preserve for Lydia. In that moment, his choice was clear. He picked up a pen, his hand steady. On the back of the check, in big, bold letters, he wrote, "Return to sender." He then tore the non-disclosure agreement neatly in half, then in quarters, and let the pieces flutter into the envelope. He sealed it, along with the voided check, and walked it down to the mailbox himself. The act was defiant, perhaps even foolish. He had just thrown away a fortune. But as he walked back to his apartment, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had drawn a line in the sand. His integrity, one of the few things he had left, was not for sale. Back in her sterile office atop the Beaumont Holdings Tower, Catherine received the returned envelope from her lawyer. Her face was a mask of disbelief as he explained that Mr. Carter had not only rejected the money, but had defaced the check and destroyed the agreement. $50,000, she said more to herself than to her lawyer. A man in his position, it makes no sense. Perhaps he's holding out for more, the lawyer suggested. We can increase the offer. No, Catherine said, a strange new feeling creeping in. It wasn't anger anymore. It was doubt. Davies's profile of a desperate opportunist was starting to fray at the edges. A desperate man would have taken the money. A calculating man would have negotiated through a lawyer, but to simply return it, to tear up the agreement, it was an act of pure, unadulterated pride. It was a message, and it was one she didn't understand. In Zoe's hospital room, the get well card from Luca and Lydia arrived, passed along by a diligent nurse. Zoe's face lit up as she saw the drawing. "Mom, look!" she exclaimed, holding it up for Catherine to see. "It's from Lydia and her dad, the man who carried me. Can we see them? I want to thank him." Catherine looked at the simple, handmade card, at the childish drawing and the plain, honest handwriting. It was such a small thing, yet it felt heavier in her hands than the $50,000 check. It was a piece of evidence that contradicted everything she had chosen to believe. For the first time, she considered the possibility that Robert Davies, in her own cynical worldview, might be wrong. Zoe's relentless questions were becoming a chisel, chipping away at the marble facade of Catherine's certainty. In the sterile, quiet opulence of her mansion, where every problem could be solved with a phone call and a wire transfer, the simple, unanswered queries of her daughter became the loudest noise in the house. "When can we see Luca and Lydia?" Zoe would ask from her position on the large sofa, her leg, now in a sleek, lightweight cast, propped up on a silk pillow. "Soon, darling," Catherine would reply, her eyes fixed on the financial data streaming across her tablet. "When you're feeling a bit stronger." "But I want to thank him properly, Mom. He was really strong, you know. He carried me the whole way, and he didn't even complain." Each question was a small crack in the narrative she and Robert Davies had so carefully constructed. The image of the desperate opportunist felt less convincing with every earnest word from her daughter's mouth. The returned $50,000 check sat in her office safe, a cold, hard piece of evidence that contradicted all her assumptions. A desperate man would have cashed it. A con artist would have held out for more. Luca Carter had simply sent it back, an act of defiance so quiet and absolute it screamed louder than any threat. The doubt had become a low hum in the back of her mind, a dissonance she couldn't ignore. The final blow to her conviction came not from a question, but from a small, insignificant object. A week into Zoe's recovery, Catherine was helping her organize the collection of get-well gifts on her bedside table when her fingers brushed against something small and wooden. She picked it up. It was a bird, carved from a single piece of pale wood, so exquisitely detailed that she could almost feel the texture of its feathers. The lines were fluid and confident, the form captured with a startling, lifelike grace. "Where did you get this, sweetheart?" Catherine asked, turning the delicate object over in her palm. It felt warm and organic, a stark contrast to the cold glass and steel that defined her world. "Luca made it for me," Zoe said simply, her eyes lighting up at the memory. "In the park. My leg hurt so bad, and I was trying not to cry. He saw I was scared, so he just took a little block of wood and a small knife out of his pocket, and he just made it. He didn't even seem to think about it. His hands just knew what to do." Catherine stared at the bird, her breath catching in her throat. This wasn't the work of a clumsy opportunist. This was the work of a master craftsman, an artist. It was a spontaneous act of kindness, created in a moment of crisis to comfort a frightened child. Then Zoe delivered the final, devastating line. "He said that when you get scared or sad, making things with your hands helps quiet the noise in your head." The phrase struck Catherine with the force of a physical blow. Quiet the noise in your head. It was an echo of her own life, a life spent building an empire, acquiring companies and dominating boardrooms, all in a frantic, relentless effort to silence the grief and loneliness that had haunted her since her husband's death. But her methods only created more noise, more pressure. Luca Carter, a man with nothing, seemed to understand a fundamental truth that she, with everything, had missed. The doubt was no longer a hum. It was a chasm that had opened up beneath her feet. She had built her empire on data, on reading people, on trusting her gut. And her gut was now screaming at her that she had made a terrible, fundamental misjudgment. The thought was so foreign, so galling, that she had to know for sure. She had to see the truth for herself, unfiltered by Davies's cynical reports and her own prejudices. The next afternoon, she did something she hadn't done in over a decade. Ignoring a dozen urgent emails and canceling a meeting with her board, she gave her driver the day off, took the keys to her Audi A8, and drove herself to Westlake. The journey was a descent through the city's socioeconomic strata. The manicured perfection of her gated community gave way to the bustling, upscale avenues of downtown. And then, crossing the river, the landscape began to fray. The architecture became utilitarian, the streets more crowded, the air thick with the energy of lives lived closer to the bone. Her gleaming luxury car felt like a spaceship landing on an alien planet, drawing curious and resentful glances. She found Luca's apartment building, a drab brick structure that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. She parked down the street feeling ridiculously conspicuous, her heart thudding with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. For 20 minutes, she just sat there, watching. She saw children playing on a patchy lawn, an elderly couple helping each other with groceries, a young man in a grease-stained jumpsuit heading home from work. It was a community, not just a set of data points in a file. Taking a deep breath, she got out of the car. Her feet, clad in expensive Italian leather loafers, felt unsteady on the cracked pavement. She wasn't sure what she was going to do. Knock on his door? Confront him? Instead, an instinct she didn't know she possessed led her around the back of the building, towards a row of dilapidated garages. The report had mentioned he rented one for storage. The door to garage number 7 was slightly ajar, a sliver of weak yellow light cutting through the encroaching dusk. As she drew closer, a scent reached her, faint at first, then richer. It was the smell of raw wood, of sawdust and varnish. It was an honest, clean smell, the smell of creation. She hesitated, feeling like a trespasser, a spy. But she had to know. She peered through the gap, and the world tilted on its axis. It was a workshop, or rather, the ghost of one. It was small and cluttered, yet possessed a sacred sense of order. Tools, old and well cared for, hung in neat rows on a pegboard. On a sturdy wooden workbench lay templates, calipers, and blocks of exotic-looking wood. Rosewood, mahogany, ebony, their grains swirling with dormant beauty. And there, in the center of the small space, resting on a stand as if on an altar, was the half-finished guitar from the photos in Davies's file. Seeing it in person was different. The photograph hadn't captured the soul of it. She could see the delicate, partially completed vine of the mother-of-pearl inlay, the flawless joinery of the mahogany body, the elegant, powerful curves that hinted at the music it was born to make. It was a masterpiece in waiting, a symphony abandoned mid-crescendo. In that dusty, dimly lit garage, the profile Davies had built fell to pieces. The cynical narrative she had clung to evaporated. This was not the hideout of a desperate con man. This was the sanctuary of a broken artist. The hands that had soothed her daughter with a small wooden bird were the same hands that had coaxed these perfect curves from a block of wood. He was a luthier, a creator of beautiful things, reduced to a life of assembling cheap furniture. A profound and unfamiliar sense of shame washed over her, hot and suffocating. She had not only misjudged him, she had insulted the very core of who he was. She had taken his art, his passion, his pain, and tried to assign it a dollar value. She backed away from the door silently, her heart pounding. As she drove away from Westlake, the polished leather of her steering wheel felt cheap and cold beneath her fingers. She hadn't just been wrong about Luca Carter. In a way, she had been wrong about everything. She now understood that this was a debt that could never be settled with a check. This would require something more. It would require a piece of herself. 2 days later, Luca was in his garage, a place that had become less a workshop and more a mausoleum for a life he no longer lived. He wasn't working. He hadn't truly worked in here for 3 years. Instead, he was performing a ritual of remembrance. With a soft, clean rag, he was methodically wiping the fine layer of dust from a set of Japanese chisels that lay in a velvet-lined wooden box. His father had given them to him, and he had once used them to carve the intricate heel of a guitar neck with surgical precision. Now his hands, accustomed to the brute force of assembling flat-pack furniture, felt clumsy and foreign, holding these delicate instruments. The air was thick with the ghosts of past projects, the sweet, vanilla-like scent of rosewood, the sharp tang of spruce, the earthy perfume of mahogany. A single bare bulb hanging from a cord cast a weak, jaundiced light over the space, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. His gaze drifted to the corner where the shrouded form of Sarah's guitar stood sentinel. He ran a hand over the smooth, unfinished body, feeling the perfect joinery, the seamless transition from curve to curve. It was a vessel of memory, filled with the silence of everything he had lost. He came here when the weight of his life felt unbearable, to breathe in the scent of the wood and remember the man he once was. It was in this profound quiet that he heard it, a soft, hesitant knock on the garage's side door. The sound was so out of place that he froze, his hand still resting on the guitar. No one ever came here. Lydia knew it was his private space, and his landlord didn't care what he did as long as the rent was paid. He felt a prickle of unease, his mind immediately jumping to debt collectors or some other harbinger of bad news. He pulled the door open a few inches, squinting into the late afternoon light. His heart dropped into his stomach. Standing there looking utterly out of place against the backdrop of peeling paint and cracked concrete was Catherine Beaumont. But it was not the same woman he had met in the park. The corporate warrior was gone. In her place was someone softer, more uncertain. Her dark hair, freed from its severe bun, fell in gentle waves around her shoulders. She wore simple dark jeans and a cashmere sweater the color of oatmeal, her hands clutching a small purse instead of a phone. The icy armor in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, unsettling vulnerability that he found more disarming than her previous hostility. In her left hand, she held the small wooden bird he had carved for Zoe. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice much quieter than he remembered it. "I know this is an intrusion. May I have a moment of your time?" Luca was too stunned to speak. His mind raced, trying to compute her presence. Had she come to threaten him again? To offer more money? He simply nodded, a tight, jerky motion, and stepped back, holding the door open. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of self-consciousness about the state of the garage. The dust, the disarray, the nakedness of his failed dream on full display. She stepped inside, her movements hesitant as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. She didn't look at him, but at the space around her. Her gaze swept over the tools hanging on the pegboard, the stacks of seasoned wood, the workbench scattered with templates and calipers. He saw her eyes linger on the elegant curve of a guitar neck clamped in a vise, and finally on the half-finished instrument he had just been touching. He saw not judgment in her expression, but a slow, dawning comprehension, as if she were finally connecting the cold, hard facts from a background check with the tangible reality of a man's soul. "I came here," she said, finally turning to face him, "to apologize." The words seemed to cost her a great deal. "My behavior, both in the park and afterward, was inexcusable. I was arrogant and I was wrong. I misjudged you completely, and I am deeply, truly sorry." Luca remained silent, his arms crossed over his chest, a defensive posture he wasn't even aware he'd taken. He had braced himself for a fight, for a negotiation, for anything but this. This raw, personal appeal left him without a script. "I saw you through the lens of my own world," she continued, her voice trembling slightly as she struggled for the words. "It's a world where everyone has an angle, a motive. I've learned to be suspicious. It's how I've survived. But that's my burden, my failing. I didn't see a kind man helping a frightened child. I saw a variable I couldn't control, a threat to be managed. That was my blindness, not your fault. The legal papers, the check, that was a crass and insulting way to respond to a genuine act of humanity. I am ashamed of it." She took a small step forward, holding out the wooden bird. It rested in her palm, a tiny, perfect thing in the center of her world of billion-dollar deals. "Zoe told me how you made this for her. She keeps it by her bed. She told me what you said, that making things with your hands helps quiet the noise in your head." Luca's eyes dropped to the bird, and his posture softened almost imperceptibly. That was a piece of him, a small truth he had shared with a child in a moment of crisis, now being handed back to him as an olive branch. He finally found his voice, the sound raspy. My wife, Sarah, she used to say my guitars weren't just made of wood, they were made of quiet. All the noise and the pressure of the world would go away when I worked. I haven't I haven't felt that quiet in a very long time. A shared unspoken grief filled the space between them. It was a profound and unexpected connection. Two single parents from two different universes, both shaped by loss, standing together in a dusty garage that smelled of forgotten melodies. Catherine nodded, her eyes glistening. My husband David passed away 5 years ago, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. He was the architect, the visionary behind our firm. I'm the one who runs the numbers, who makes the deals. After he died, I built Beaumont Holdings into an empire. I told myself I was honoring his legacy, but really, I was just trying to quiet the noise. But the bigger it got, the louder the silence became. It was a stunning admission, a moment of profound honesty that completely dismantled the wall between them. In that instant, she wasn't a billionaire CEO, and he wasn't a struggling handyman. They were just two people who understood the shape of the hole that loss leaves behind. She took a deep breath, and a flicker of her usual resolve returned to her eyes, though now it was tempered with a newfound humility. An apology isn't enough, she said, her tone shifting. Words are easy. I can't undo my actions, but I would like to try and make things right. And I want to be very clear, Mr. Carter. This isn't charity, it's a proposition. Luca looked at her, skepticism returning. A proposition? Beaumont Holdings is launching a new global hotel chain, the Artisan Collection. The entire brand concept is built around unique, handcrafted quality. We're fighting against the sterile, mass-produced luxury that dominates the market. Every detail, from the lobby desks to the headboards to the art on the walls, is meant to be bespoke. We need a visionary to oversee it all, someone with an unimpeachable eye for genuine craftsmanship, someone who understands the soul of things. She paused, letting her words sink in. I want you to head the entire division, to build and lead a team of artisans from the ground up, to be the guardian of its quality, to ensure every single piece is authentic. Luca was speechless. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor of his garage had dropped away. He looked from her earnest face to his own calloused hands, then back again. Head a division? Him? The man who had to water down his milk last week? Before he could even process the thought, she continued. And, she added, her voice softening again, that's just the day job, a way to provide stability for you and your daughter. I also want to invest, not in a division, not in my company, but in your art. Her gaze shifted to the unfinished guitar. I want to be the first client of the newly relaunched Carter guitars. I want to commission you to finish that guitar. And then I want you to build another one for me, and another for whoever wants one. I will provide all the capital you need to relaunch your brand. A proper workshop, not a garage. The best, most ethically sourced materials on the planet. An apprentice if you want one. This is not a gift. It's a business partnership. Your talent is a rare and valuable commodity, Luca. I just want to put it back where it belongs. He stared at her, then at the ghost of Sarah's guitar. She hadn't just offered him a job. She hadn't just offered him money. She had seen him, the real him. The artist buried beneath years of grief and grinding survival. She was offering him his life back. She was offering him the quiet, a pressure built behind his eyes, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. Tears, hot and sharp, welled up, the first he had shed since the day he'd lost Sarah. He thought of Lydia, of a future where he could give her everything she deserved, a future that wasn't dictated by the constant, crushing anxiety of poverty. He thought of the feel of a perfectly balanced tool in his hand, of the scent of spruce, and the infinite promise of a melody waiting to be born from wood and wire. He reached out and touched the guitar, his fingers tracing the mother-of-pearl inlay. It felt like coming home. He took a shaky breath, the dust of his old life filling his lungs one last time. Okay, he whispered. the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 silent prayers. Okay, Catherine. A smile of profound, genuine relief broke across her face, transforming her. It reached her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. My friends call me Kate, she said softly. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. It was a beginning, the start of a partnership built not on a transaction, but on a shared understanding of loss and a hard-won mutual respect. It was the beginning of a future for two families, unexpectedly intertwined by an accident in the woods. And for Luca Carter, as he stood in the dim light of his workshop, it was the first, clear, resonant note of a beautiful and long-forgotten song. In the quiet hum of life's challenges, we often forget the profound impact of a single act of kindness. Luca Carter's story isn't just about a struggling father or a billionaire's gratitude. It's a powerful reminder that our true worth is not measured by our bank accounts, but by our character. It shows us that beneath the surface of titles and circumstances, we are all connected by our capacity for compassion, our hidden griefs, and our dormant dreams. Luca helped a child not for a reward, but because it was the right thing to do. In turn, Catherine Beaumont looked past her own prejudices to see the artist, not just the man, reviving a dream and, in doing so, perhaps finding a piece of her own lost humanity. Their story teaches us that the greatest investments we can ever make are in each other. If this story of second chances and unexpected connections resonated with you, please help us share it by hitting the like button. Consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss more real-life stories about the quiet heroes and hidden artists among us. And please share your thoughts in the comments below. Has a simple act of kindness ever changed the course of your life? Thank you for listening.